Welcome to the Travel Tips and Trips podcast, where we are exploring the world one destination at a time and sharing tons of great travel tips and inspiration along the way. In this episode, I'm going to be taking a deep dive into the Bolivian Amazon, one of my favorite adventures to date, travel fails and weather delays aside, and one of the most biodiverse destinations on the planet. So if you're interested in hearing more about my adventures in the Bolivian Amazon, stick around and let's jump right into the deep dive. So I visited the Bolivian Amazon in 2014 with my then boyfriend, now husband, and it was an adventure, to say the least. I think when most people think of the Amazon, they think of either Brazil or Peru, but the Bolivian Amazon is actually pretty unique in a few different ways. For one, the Bolivian Amazon actually has lower levels of deforestation compared to neighboring Brazil and Peru. This is partly due to Bolivia's smaller population, but also their more restrictive land use policies. And yes, Bolivia has still experienced deforestation, but those more restrictive land use policies in place do seem to help and also contribute to making the Bolivian Amazon all that much more biodiverse. As I already mentioned in the intro of this episode, the Bolivian Amazon is actually known to be one of the most biodiverse destinations on the planet. It's home to more than 2,000 species of birds, which may not sound super impressive if you aren't like a big bird enthusiast, but I promise once you're there, you'll become obsessed with the birds. I know I did, and I am not a bird enthusiast at all. Bird watching is almost never on my to-do list. But it was on that trip that I discovered what is now my favorite bird, the jabiru, which is not just one of the largest birds in the New World, but also the tallest flying bird in South America. This bird has a wingspan of something like 8 feet. And the first time that I saw a jabiru, I was actually, well, there was two flying side by side, and they flew over us on our boat heading up the Amazon River. Total wingspan there of 16 feet. And it was honestly like being in Jurassic Park. It was a wild moment and one that I will never forget. Birds aside though, the Bolivian Amazon also has somewhere around 300 species of mammals, countless reptiles, insects, and plant species. It really is like being on an entirely different planet in a lot of ways, especially coming from where I live in Canada. But I ultimately chose to visit the Bolivian Amazon for 3 reasons: the accessibility, the cost, and the dolphins. So when I say accessibility, I don't mean you just like fly into Bolivia's international airport and stroll on in. It's still a challenging location to visit, all in all, no matter where you visit from. But some parts of the Bolivian Amazon are more accessible or more easily reached by air. For example, Rurenbach or Rurenbake, I don't know. I have heard that town pronounced about 100 different ways. I know that I'm pronouncing it wrong, so forgive me, but I'm going to go ahead and call it Rurenbach. And it is easily accessed by air from La Paz, so it can be a little bit easier to get to and also a little easier to do on a whim as well, because the crowds in Bolivia are often a lot less than in other locations. So as far as availability at eco lodges and on tours, you are bound to have a little bit better luck if you're booking last minute. So we actually did fly that route from La Paz, and I think that was actually the first time on our South America trip that I experienced any elevation sickness, going from La Paz at such a high elevation to sea level, and then the same on the way back to La Paz afterwards. So definitely prepare yourself to feel a little wonky if that's the route that you take. It wasn't too bad though. You just want to give yourself a little time to adjust, stay hydrated, don't go running laps when you land, all of that good stuff. And then we stayed one night in a guest house in town before driving out with our guide to our riverboat, and then that took us to our eco lodge on the river. Now, we were told a few hours for travel to the boat, but we also went in shoulder season when the river was still high so that we could see the river dolphins. So the dirt road that we were driving was an absolute nightmare. I don't know what I expected during the planning process, but we spent hours navigating around mud pits, getting pulled out of the mud, and then helping to pull others out of the mud. And that's the one thing about a lot of these remote locations. If you're in trouble, you can often be waiting hours for help to drive by. And if you see someone else in trouble, you really do have to stop because the next vehicle to help them could be hours behind you. At some point, I actually put together a YouTube video with clips from this drive. So if I can find that, I will link it in the video description for you to check out. But yeah, needless to say, it was a pretty wild adventure from minute one. So it ended up taking us from sunrise to sunset to get to our accommodations along the river and our eco lodge in the jungle. I actually don't think that we minded it that much at the time, though. It is what it is. We weren't trying to like catch a flight or anything, so we just kind of went with it, go with the flow, and it really made for such a memorable experience, actually. And I actually find that to be true for a lot of our trips. It's those moments like that kind of become the stories that you tell, because no one wants to sit around and listen to your stories about how once you went on a jungle trip and everything went great, which is also bringing up memories of the time that I got lost at sea in a motorless longtail boat in the middle of the night in Thailand, but I digress. That is a story for another day. Getting back on track, we traveled with Bala Tours, which was middle of the road budget-wise for the Bolivian Amazon at the time, but still quite a bit cheaper than any tours that I found when I was looking at the Peruvian Amazon or the Brazilian Amazon, which were the other two destinations that I was considering during the planning process. And so that's why I mention cost as one of the three reasons that I chose the Amazon in Bolivia. It was just quite a bit cheaper, and although there are beautiful eco lodges on my bucket list for the Amazon in other regions as well, we were on a fairly tight budget at the time, and we weren't really sure if we would ever be back again, so we wanted to get the best bang for our buck, which I think we definitely got. Definitely the best way, and really the only way to experience the Bolivian Amazon is through a guided tour, though. Logistics of travel and transportation aside, you really need a trained guide who knows the way, first and foremost, who knows what animals, birds, and insects are around, what you need to be cautious of, someone who knows, what could kill you. So yes, you'll need a guide. We did a 3-day tour in and out, and I feel like that was the perfect amount of time, honestly. One tip that I do have is to print off your tour information and have that with you during your trip. Do not rely on technology at all, and definitely don't rely on having internet to pull that up if you need it. Paper copy all the way, just in case anything goes wrong with your guide or with your booking and you need to have that information on hand. You'll also need to be prepared for the limited infrastructure that exists out there. Everywhere we went was accessible only by boat and then on foot, so you'll need to pack appropriate gear like insect repellent. The bugs were surprisingly not too bad when we were there, given that it was wetter season, but bug repellent is still necessary regardless. Sturdy shoes. I trekked my hiking boots around for months in preparation for the Amazon and never regretted it even once. And then a good rain jacket as well and quick drying clothing if you can. It really made all the difference because it did get pretty damp out there. Now, we did the Pampas tour, and there are really two different popular routes that you can take in the Bolivian Amazon. There's the Pampas, which is more of a wetland in the Amazon basin, and then there's the jungle tours that take place in the Madidi National Park. Again, with the pronunciation, I wish I knew. I apologize. Pampas being in the wetlands, perhaps there's a chance that it was more wet in some ways, but regardless of the tour that you choose, you're still in the rainforest. So my best advice is really just prepare for the wettest. And if you're wondering why we chose Pampas over jungle, that brings me to my third point for the Bolivian Amazon, which was the pink river dolphins. With the Pampas tour, there was a higher chance of seeing more wildlife, specifically in the shoulder season when we visited, because there's less vegetation in that region for wildlife to kind of hang out and hide in. And then you also have a much higher chance of seeing and swimming with the river dolphins, which we wanted to do. We wanted to go piranha fishing, which we did. And then we also still got to do jungle walks and that type of thing in addition to our boat tours. We were mostly exploring by boat, though, each day versus the national park, which is right in the middle of the Bolivian Amazon. And on that tour, it's a little bit more challenging to spot wildlife in amongst all of that super dense vegetation. There would have been a chance to see more of those like bucket list animal spotting animals like jaguars, for example, had we chosen that tour. And that did kind of have me wavering for a moment. But all in all, I really wanted to see the river dolphins and be on the water. So that is why we made the choice that we did. And if you're wondering, we did see the dolphins and swim with them, which was an amazing experience. Just laying out in the river, surrounded by lush forests and giant swooping Jurassic Park style birds, the dolphins playing around us. It was a once in a lifetime moment that I wouldn't trade for absolutely anything. That said, though, swimming with the dolphins in their natural habitat has been criticized quite a lot, especially in the years since our visit, as unethical. And I feel like it would be pretty irresponsible of me not to touch on that. At the time of our trip back in 2014, I hadn't really heard anything about the swimming with the dolphins being criticized in any way. I really felt like as long as the dolphins weren't enclosed and it was their natural habitat and they weren't being fed or lured to us in any way, what harm could that really do? But looking back and having heard the arguments against it since, it is more clear to me that no matter how ethically it's done, we weren't the only people there for that experience, right? So interacting with humans frequently like that can not only disturb the natural behavior for dolphins, but interactions with humans, and this is something that I never considered, can also lead to an increased stress for those dolphins, which can negatively impact their health. For us, in our experience, they seemed happy and playful. They approached us and they were curious about us, so I wasn't really looking at it any differently than stumbling across any other animal in the wild, but unfortunately, that's just not the case, because as the years have gone on, there's more and more groups more frequently being brought to where they naturally reside to interact with them. And so I don't want to sit here and pretend that that's not a problem. There are also conservation concerns associated with swimming with the dolphins that weren't quite as public at the time either. The dolphins now are considered a vulnerable species by the World Wildlife Foundation because of the continued exploitation for tourism purposes and how that undermines the conservation efforts aimed at protecting them from things like habitat destruction, pollution, and sad that I even have to say this, but from hunting as well. And then lastly, and I don't want to dwell on this for too long, but I do feel like I need to mention swimming with the pink river dolphins can also be seen as culturally insensitive because they do hold a significant spiritual and cultural value in many indigenous Amazonian cultures, which we were not made aware of during our trip, nor was that something that I even considered. And if there's one thing that I do talk about over and over again when I talk about traveling the world, It's the importance of respecting the home and the culture of the people whose land that you're visiting. So I think had we had any idea that the indigenous peoples there might not have been okay with that, we certainly would not have done it and would have been fine just sort of seeing them from a distance had we come across them naturally, which is something that did happen also on a couple of occasions as we were floating along in our boat. So we would have seen them regardless. So with those points in mind, I would definitely at the very least be asking questions before going ahead and joining a tour that in this day and age is still offering swimming with the dolphins as an included activity. But dolphins aside though, if you're asking if a visit to the Bolivian Amazon is worth adding to your bucket list, I'm here to say absolutely. It was easily one of the most unique and diverse ecosystems that we explored during our 6 months in South America. And every minute of the trip was an absolute adventure, whether we were driving in and out, we were on the boat, cruising along under giant jabiru birds, falling asleep in the pitch darkness of the eco lodge, listening to the chirps and creaks of everything going on outside. I would do it again in a heartbeat. And it is something that is on my bucket list to revisit and do again. So that's where I'm going to leave things today. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of this deep dive. And as always, stay great, travel safe, and I'll chat with you in the next episode of the Travel Tips and Trips podcast.